Most of us got into IT for the technology, but more and more, we're increasingly emergency responders. I've been thinking about that space and wanted to talk to somebody. Christopher Tarantino is an expert in emergency management and has put together a resiliency framework. Let's talk to him on this bonus episode of The Business of Tech. Well, Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I always start with the kind of easiest question of them all. Is tell me a little bit about your journey. Tell me about how you got here and your background.
That's the easiest question, man. That's intimidating. It's it's been a journey. So I started off my professional career in marketing, and at the same time, actually was working as a firefighter, as an EMT. And as I progressed, I started working for FEMA, started working for a bunch of different public safety agencies. And one thing led to another, and I started a company called Epicenter Innovation with the goal of marrying those two worlds, bringing the business acumen, marketing methodology, skill sets, things of that nature to the government and public safety space to help them communicate more effectively in disasters. And then that mission has grown into just a whole innovation management perspective.
So define disaster for me. What are the disasters that you focus on?
Yeah, so when we teach emergency management or what we call resilience innovators about this field, we talk about the terms disaster, emergency, crisis, because we tend to use those words interchangeably. And they definitely shouldn't be. I think it's kind of a slippery slope because then I might be talking about one thing, you might be talking about another thing. When I think of the word, emergency, I think of the word, think of unplanned incident that affects life and property. A disaster would be something that it's of the same, right? So every emergency or every disaster is an emergency, but not every emergency may be a disaster. We deal with emergencies all the time, right? A flat tire, for example, but it's not necessarily a disaster, which would be a major car crash with injuries or something like that. The difference between an emergency and a disaster is that a disaster exceeds your capability to respond to it. You need something additional in order to respond more effectively. And then sometimes people end up talking and asking about the word crisis. And for me, the word crisis involves some sort of reputational risk. And so again, an emergency could expand into a disaster. There could be some element of crisis. Every crisis could, potentially have some emergency flavor thrown in. Every emergency may have some crisis. So they do interchange, but they're not technically interchangeable.
That's a really interesting definition. So by that definition, the barrier would change, right? So an organization would be able to handle more, and thus things that formerly might be disasters are now emergencies. Is that a fair way of looking at it? Does that happen?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's exactly why, when we have disaster here or even, emergencies here that are of a certain breed, of a certain size, with certain frequency, that they're not earth-shattering. They may hit the news, they may be devastating in the localized area, but it's not going to destabilize our economy, for example, and we're not going to have decades-long impact for some of these disasters. Some definitely we do. But then you go to another country or to another geography, and that same disaster, if I were to just pick it up and plop it down in the same space, it may be a totally different story. So you have to build that into the equation. We're talking about risk, we're talking about impact, we're talking about vulnerability. And in all of those things, if you don't consider your level of capability, you're probably missing a really, really important part of the equation.
I'm going to actually start with a premise because these definitions, which I will freely admit I'm learning as we discuss, have now opened my eyes on an idea. And I've said, we talk in technology oftentimes about disaster recovery. I think by your definition, that's actually the wrong name. So would disaster recovery as a planning methodology for, cyber and backups, is that a wrong name?
I wouldn't go as far as to say it's wrong, but I would say that it's a little bit incomplete. We in my field, in the disaster management field, and again, right, we're using the word disaster, but you're talking about IT disaster recovery. I'm talking about life safety disasters and earthquakes and hurricanes and wildfires, things of that nature. We think and we tend to plan around the worst case scenario. And I don't think that's necessarily the worst thing we could do. I think it's important to know what you're most at risk for. However, what really governs all of that stuff, all the really important knowledge, all the important skills, all the important frameworks, I would package up in just a blanket incident management terminology. I'd say that what we're talking about there is incident management, and the type of incident, the frequency of incident, the scope of that incident really doesn't matter. We take what's called an all hazards or all threats approach, which means that if you build your plans right, if you train your people right, it doesn't matter which disaster or which incident you're managing, you'll be effective.
But it's interesting because the connection to life and limb, right, feels like an important part of that. And as we become more and more reliant on technology for all parts, particularly when we think about things like healthcare is a really obvious one.
Yeah.
Incidents there can directly be connected to patient outcomes, and that's a nice way of saying people could die, right? So there's been a ratcheting up of the pressure on technology and technologists to deliver at that level. And I think where I'm going with this is are you seeing that connection from your side of things, like dealing with those previously conventional ones? Is this new space connecting in your experience?
I see those connections a lot, and I probably see those connections maybe a little bit more readily than either side of that equation does just innately, because that's where we sit. So Epicenter Innovation exists to empower what we call resilience innovators, which is not just disaster management professionals. That's how we started. We started off as an emergency management consulting firm, so life safety, property preservation, all the stuff that you might think of when you think of FEMA or any other agency that might be active following a large-scale disaster incident. And we've expanded that mission to include all the people that are on the fringes, the people that you're kind of talking about in terms of, they don't have the title emergency manager, but they're definitely managing emergencies, or they're definitely managing incidents, to use our earlier definition, right? And so there's many more people that fit that bill, especially today, and especially in this, I hesitate to use the word post-COVID, but you know what I mean, wherever we are in that chain of events, there's many more people now that fit that description that have been called to perform extreme and extraordinary tasks and have called outside of their day-to-day job, their day-to-day role, and they're a little bit out of their depth in terms of their skill set. Those are all the underlying frameworks of what makes a public safety first responder effective or ineffective, is their ability to rise to that equation. So I think what we're seeing now is the interconnectedness between that. And so I see both sides. I see IT playing one way. I see emergency management playing another way. One's focused on consequences. One's focused on the precursor to those consequences. I think they're starting to talk together more, but there's obviously more conversations we need to have.
Well, okay, so what are those conversations? What do we need to be pulling together to be more effective in this space? Because I look at it and say, like, the technology side, I'm looking around and say, like, I don't think we're very good at this, and I don't think I don't think we're well armed. I don't think we're well equipped. What conversation do we need to be having?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations we need to be having, and I think a lot of agencies are starting to have them, and individual champions are forcing those conversations in some spaces, which is a good thing. I think first and foremost, we have to understand that we're trying to accomplish the same thing, but just doing so with a wildly different set of tools. So where the public safety type people might be thinking about planning, they might be thinking about response or recovery, they're going to use a different tool set than someone who's in cybersecurity or someone who's focused on doing penetration testing or information security or whatever the scope may be. Using a different toolkit, they're trying to avoid bad things happening. And the bad thing of the day may be totally different depending on who you ask. It may be a ransomware attack. It may be a tornado. It could be a whole host of other things. I think putting those individuals in scenarios where they have to work together and they have to see face to face, they have to come face to face with the interconnectedness of what they're doing. I'll tell a really brief story. We were working with a college in upstate New York a few years back, and we noticed in doing some assessments and studying their campus that they had some servers that were in the basement. And their server room, it wasn't their main one. It was one that they just kind of like expanded into, or maybe that was their original one. Regardless, these were kind of like the forgotten servers that no one really pays much attention to and everybody walks by on a day-to-day basis. Well, we found out also that it's also co-located with their water main for that particular building. And so we said, well, this is a great opportunity to bring these two groups together to show them how they can avoid a bad thing from happening. We have to motivate them. So it's easy to say, hey, your water main is next to your server. That's probably a bad idea. That doesn't make anybody want to invest in changing that status quo. And you have to admit that most human beings have something called optimism bias, which means that they believe that the bad thing isn't going to happen to them. And it's really, really hard to fight. So we had to make it important not just to the IT people, not just to the disaster management people, because those people are always, doom and gloom, looking forward to what's bad that's going to happen. We had to also make it important to the executive leadership and the finance people. And the way that we did that is we asked, well, what actually lives on this server? And it turns out it was their finance software. It was all of their billing capability. And so we ran an exercise and we showed them that a water main break and that their server was offline and they weren't able to bill for an entire semester of services, and they had to go and figure all that out. That made it really, really important to them to actually make some changes rather than just saying, oh, wow, that seems like something we should figure out.
So what are those big key skills that emergency management professionals train for? What are the skills that they bring to the table? Because it feels like there would be a lot to learn from
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. There's a lot. So when I think about this whole framework, I think of skills, traits, and attributes. I think about, as an emergency manager or, in my history as a firefighter and an EMT, we focus a lot on skill building. We focus a lot on figuring out, how are you actually going to do your job? When I think of skills, I often think of things that you're going to do with your hands or maybe with your mouse on your computer. And there are things that you know how to do, and there are things that you can learn how to do. The biggest thing for me is actually less about the skill, because I can teach just about anybody a skill. If we're on a major incident like a mass casualty or something like that, and I have a bunch of people around me that aren't injured and they're looking to help, I can teach them how to hold cervical spine to keep someone, from further injuring themselves. I can verbally tell someone how to do CPR. I can explain a lot of those skills. Now, will they do them as effectively as I might, or as effectively as a paramedic might, or something like that? No, but you're in a disaster, which means you have to work with what you have. So skills I'm actually less worried about. I think a lot about attributes and traits, however. So in our work expanding beyond the emergency management realm of things, this persona of the resilience innovator came out. And at first it was just kind of a name for this ephemeral concept that we had of people that were, called to do extraordinary things but didn't necessarily have the extraordinary skills that they needed to do that task. And so what we've done over the last year actually is do a bunch of research on exactly that. What goes into being a resilience innovator? How do you assess your own level of resilience? And more importantly, how do you then propagate resilience and the ability to create innovative teams in others? And so what's come out of that actually is a list of 50 key traits. And then actually what's come out of that even further is 10 typologies of different types of people that have kind of emerged, different types of archetypes really, personas that have emerged to show us what types of things people need to be good at in order to be effective at different phases. So I won't go through all the different types or whatever. In fact, we haven't even launched this as of recording. We haven't even launched the assessment that we designed just yet, but it'll probably be out by the time this airs. We came up with a few different ones that, with a business psychology firm are backed by research. So for example, there's a dichotomy between two of the types. One's the maverick and the other's the architect. The maverick is the person that's going to rush in to respond. They're going to be very effective in the immediate aftermath of an incident. They're going to have that knee-jerk reaction, and they don't need a plan necessarily to be effective because they run on instinct. They use their gut, and they're very effective in those scenarios. But after the disaster's over, they're not the person that you want to go write the report when it's all done, right? On the other side of that same dichotomy, the architect is someone who you want in that planning mode. You want them preparing for disasters. You want them recovering from them so that way you can better do it next time. Those two personas don't necessarily have to be complete opposites of each other. Most people are going to be living in the middle, which means that we can leverage those unique skill sets and those unique attributes at various phases of a disaster. I'd much rather have the maverick in certain scenarios during response than the architect maybe probably before a disaster actually strikes.
So is the way that's used to make sure that essentially the right people are in the right places at the right time? Is that what you're doing? You're identifying your team and knowing how to deploy them. How do you use these assessments?
Yeah, exactly. Because we're so focused on skills, everything that I have seen in my career in the true disaster management space has been all oriented around that. It's around what your title is, what training you've been to, if you've actually deployed and been to large scale incidents, and if so, what type, what kind, what scope. However, it doesn't account for certain things that are more innate, things that are more ingrained. We took a hard look and we talked with a bunch of our colleagues. We said, there was a feeling that I had when I first started working in EMS, and especially after I was in the medical service and the fire service and special operations for a few years. I could see a new recruit come in and tell you within an hour of just talking with them, not even on a call, if they were going to work out or not. But I couldn't articulate why I felt that way. And this is the benefit of an assessment like this is to try to get a little bit closer to that, to try to be able to have a shared language where we can have conversations around things that aren't skill building, things that are more innate to the individual themselves.
Now, it's really sexy to drive right to the we use these when we deploy in tornadoes and hurricanes, but I would think that this model could be used essentially for any high pressure response scenario. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, and ideally, if you're using any assessments, whether it's the Resilience Innovator type assessment or something different like a Myers-Briggs or a DISC or anything like that, I've been working with Myers-Briggs for a long, long time, and the ideal scenario is to do it well before you're ever in the bad thing, because then you can build team cohesion and you can build a whole host of resources and conversations that are going to set you up for success, because you're building on a foundation of self-awareness. I think that is really one of the key things that being an emergency responder has taught me, is that if you're not self-aware, if you're not aware of your skills gap, if you're not aware of your tendencies or your preferences, you're probably going to lose, because the incident is going to show those things to you. And if you're not prepared to come face to face with that, you're going to have a bad time.
This feels like there's also a connection to mental health and helping your team manage, but I'm not the expert, so help me understand how that connection works and how you use it for maintaining mental health among a team.
Totally, yeah. There's definitely a connection. I think that's come to the fore a lot more in our society, even just in the last couple of years, which is absolutely a good thing. Especially in the public safety space, we've seen way too many people get consumed by the demons of their past and not make it out all right. And I think what happens is when lay people that are not in the public safety field, which have not been trained, which have not been not undergone things like stress inoculation, getting exposed to extreme stress, getting exposed to those types of things day after day, and building a little bit of hardness around it. When the average person gets exposed to some of those things, they're either going to freeze, they're either going to rise to the occasion, or they're going to crumble. And usually what we see is, even if they rise to the occasion, that there is a degradation over time. It could be hours, it could be minutes, it could be days, it could be years before that wall breaks. And so they're fine, and then all of a sudden they're not fine anymore. So obviously, the more self-aware a person is, the better we can handle those types of things. And if we foster psychological safety, if we foster strong, in-depth, transparent, and raw conversations with our teams, then we can also kind of just look out for each other a little bit more, rather than trying to keep up the facade, especially in public safety. I definitely grew up with that, where you're supposed to be the macho man or the macho woman and nothing's supposed to affect you. And there's still some of that. That still definitely exists. I won't lie and pretend like it's gone. However, it's much easier to have conversations these days to be like, hey, you know what, I'm actually not all right, or that call we just went on was really messed up, and I feel like I need to talk to somebody about that. Those stigmas are starting to go away. And I think it's a good thing, because the whole premise of our work at Epicenter Innovation was to kind of connect resilience and innovation. And for the longest time, we were pursuing innovation at any cost. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, and a lot of geographies were doing that. You look around the world, and that's been happening for a long, long time. And what our research has shown, and what we're going to try to continue to prove, is that resilience actually is the precursor to innovation, not the other way around. Resilience is the foundation on which everything else is built.
That's an interesting premise. So for those technology services companies that are listening to this now and are saying, I'm starting to notice that what was a simple operation of kind of help desk support and engagement that used to be kind of very easy transaction has moved to a much more high pressure, emergency or disaster, depending on the situation, response scenario. What advice would you give them as they're thinking to say, maybe I really ought to think about organizing this more formally? What advice would you give them?
The best advice I would say is try not to hold on to the past too hard. There's stuff to be learned there. There's definitely a foundation to be built on there. But don't hold on to the past too hard. There's a saying in the fire service that, it's 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. You don't want that to describe your office or your organization. But I'll use the fire service as an analogy actually real quick about that, because in the fire service, people think, oh, well, if you're a firefighter, you're putting out fires all the time. Fires account for a very, very small percentage of the work that we ever did in the fire service. It's mostly EMS, it's a whole host of other things. But over the last 20, 30, 50 years, the scope of the role of a firefighter has expanded to include everything related to utility incidents, to water, to special operations, collapse, trench rescue, you name it. We're called to know, understand, and respond on the worst day to things that most of us had never been exposed to before. We have to be electricians, we have to be handymen, we have to be carpenters, we have to be all these different things to all these different types of people, because when people call 911, that's what they expect. They expect you to be able to figure out the problem. Well, that's the parallel now to what I see is if you're an IT service provider, the expectations are similarly expanding. You're expected to know about every type of software, hardware, firmware, everything that you might have on a machine or with a server. Everyone expects you to know about that thing. And so what advice I would give is from the fire service, which is to rise to the occasion, have a smile on when you get the question, but be honest about whether or not you've seen this before, and don't be afraid to call for mutual aid. Call someone else that can help you out if they have more expertise than you. And don't be shy. Don't pretend that you know about a thing if it hits your desk and you don't necessarily know about it. Everyone, deserves to be able to share their expertise and deserves to be able to have the help that they deserve. But you're more than a help desk person now. And even though that may still be your title, there's probably a lot more by way of expectations management that you have to do in order to rise to that.
And what would you tell to the leaders of those orgs if they were saying, I need to build a better response system so that things move from that line of we're handling disasters to we are handling emergencies and we can actually be in the place where we plan? What advice would you give to those leaders?
Start with the conversations. Be realistic about what you might face. Talk to the experts. If you are, at a private sector entity, or maybe you work at a college or university or in healthcare or wherever, chances are you probably have a public safety, campus safety, emergency management office. If you haven't talked to them yet, go get them a coffee, get them to buy you a coffee, whatever, and have a conversation and say, hey, what keeps you up at night related to the things that I do? And then tell them the same. Tell them what keeps you up at night for the things that they do. And figure out what the similarities are. Start there. Then build a structure around that and be realistic. I think people get excited about that worst case scenario, but most of the time, 98%, 95% of the time, we're doing business as usual. So don't implode your basic processes or your normal way of doing things, under the guise of saying that, well, we're going to be more prepared for the big incident. Don't make things less effective by doomsdaying your scenario. However, be realistic about what those doomsday scenarios might be. If there are things that keep you up at night, make sure that you have those things documented. Make sure that you have people cross-trained, maybe not to an extreme level, but make sure that they know how to step in for each other. I think we saw a lot of that, in COVID, where workforce challenges that were not directly tied to anything IT related or anything, HR related, came in and hit us. We had people that were out. We had people that couldn't come into the office. We had people that had to go fully remote and had to deal with home Wi-Fi, home internet issues, things of that nature. Well, that impacted our level of response. That impacted the way that we showed up. So again, being realistic, seeing the interconnectedness between all of our systems, all of our incidents, that'll be a good start to the conversation. And then just figure out, how does that cycle look for us? Preparedness, response, recovery. There's a whole myriad of different cycles that you could look at that expand beyond that. But if you could look at that before, during, and after, you'll be much better off.
Chris, if people were interested in learning more or leveraging those assessments, where would those resources be?
Yeah, so folks can feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. That'd be a great way to do it. Christopher Tarantino. You can also go to the Epicenter Innovation website. It's just www.epicenter-innovation.com. And you'll see some stuff on the assessment. You also see some benchmarking surveys too, if you have any emergency management friends that want to kind of see how their agency stacks up. All that stuff's on there. And you'll be able to explore the Resilience Innovator Learning Lab, the Resilience Innovator Type Assessment, and a whole bunch of other resources.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I really had a blast. And Dave, thanks for having me.
Thanks for your time and attention. Time is a finite resource, and I really value you giving me some of yours. If you like this video, you can let me know with a like of the video, and even more valuable, hitting the subscription button. My content is all free, and I use metrics like subscriptions to pay the bills, so it has real value. The content here is produced under ethics guidelines posted at businessof.tech. If you're interested in more content like this, you can get access to content early via our Patreon at patreon.com/MSPradio. It's our give what you want model where you set the value of what you think the content is worth. If you like this podcast, you can catch it daily as the 5-minute news and commentary show, The Business of Tech, available on all your favorite podcatchers with links at businessof.tech. Just hit that big blue button to subscribe. Again, thank you for taking time out of your day to listen, and I really value the interaction. If you want to say something in the comments, I do respond and watch all that, and I look forward to talking to you next time.